All right, welcome everybody. My name's Rich Reed, and I'm the director of the Southwest Harbor Public Library. I'm so glad to join you for tonight's presentation of Reading with Wings. It's a partnership with one of our closest neighbors in so many ways, the Wendell Gilley Museum. I want to make a quick advertisement for a past Reading with Wings presenter, birding mystery writer Steve Burrows. He has a new book in his series coming out this summer, The Deceit of Lapwings. His past presentation can be found on the library's YouTube channel. Despite it being 10 degrees this morning in Acadia, as I was on my way for a cross-country ski, I convincingly heard a woodpecker drumming, so spring may be nigh. And with that optimism, it's my pleasure to introduce the director of the Wendell Gilley Museum, Sean Charette.
Thank you, E-Rich. Appreciate that. As E-Rich just said, I'm the director of the Wendell Gilley Museum, and we're right down the street. We're neighbors, and so very, very, very happy about this Reading with Wings program. I want to welcome all of you tonight. We have a great group tonight. We have a large group and from all over the place, so welcome. And a special welcome to you, Jessica. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You're joining us from Nashville, correct?
Yes,
Outside Nashville. Excellent. So, as you probably already know, Jessica is a best-selling author and illustrator. And as you'll see tonight, she has a really, truly deep connection with nature. And she shares that through her talents for making beautiful art and writing. As you'll see tonight, she uses this just gorgeous combination of color and pattern to create these really, you'll see in this book, these really compelling portraits of the flora and fauna in the world around us. And you will feel her love of nature and of art tonight as we, through this book, really explore, or she will help us explore, symbolism and folklore around birds. Jessica's style, really, these striking visuals and this kind of air of mystery that you get from some of her artwork. So I wanted to just, it's really appealing, I think, to all ages. I wanted to just take a minute and give you a little more information about her. Her illustrations appear in many books, including the New York Times bestselling The Wheel of the Year, an illustrated guide to nature rhythms, and a few others I'll just mention. There's one called Florography. So this is Ornithography. Another one called Florography, an illustrated guide to the Victorian language of flowers, and very exciting, Jane Austen's Garden, a botanical tour of classic novels, which, Jessica, you want to make a little announcement about that?
Yeah, it comes out next week on March 11th. So you can pre-order that wherever you like to buy your books from. And it's a really beautiful book, and it's so thoughtfully researched by Molly Williams, who is the author. And I have something around 100-ish illustrations appearing in the book. And it's a really beautiful collection and homage to the beautiful writing and work that Jane Austen did.
That's exciting. Good timing.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'll just mention another series of books, which I haven't seen, but I'm excited to check out. So you have a series of folklore field guides, explore dragons and mermaids and fairies, and I'm sure a lot of other creatures too. So
yeah,
sounds really cool.
Yeah, those are really fun.
Yeah. Jessica's art appears in a lot of other places as well. Work for private clients and publications, including the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that is, Smithsonian Magazine, New Yorker, and many, many others. I'm sure she will mention this, but I would highly recommend a visit to her website, which is her name, Jessica Roux, with a dash in between, jessica-roux.com. There is so much great art on that website. I mean, you can really spend some time on there and have fun. So I would highly recommend a visit. So here at the Gilley Museum, our guiding words are connecting people, nature, and art. And we are thrilled to be talking about birds this evening, birds and art. And I want to thank you, E-Rich, and the library for making this series possible. It's a fantastic way to explore literature and art and the world around us. So thank you. I do want to let you all know, everyone who's with us, we'd love you to be part of the conversation. So if you have thoughts or questions as you feel inspired, you will find a Q&A button. If you kind of hover along the bottom or one of the edges of the screen, that'll pop up. So just type your question, your thought in there, and we'll make sure that you get an answer to that. Thanks again for being with us, and especially to you, Jessica, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you both for the wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here and really grateful both to the Wendell Gilley Museum and the Southwest Harbor Public Library for inviting me and having me on to talk about one of my absolute favorite subjects, which is birds. So I wrote and illustrated this book, Ornithography, and I'm going to share a couple entries from it, a little bit about my work, my process, and yeah, please feel free to ask questions, which I'll try to get to all of them in the end. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. So let's see. All right, so there's the cover of the book, Ornithography, an illustrated guide to bird lore and symbolism. And so a little bit about how this book got made. It all started back in 2020 when my first book came out, which is Florography, an illustrated guide to the Victorian language of flowers. So the Victorian language of flowers has been something that's always been super interesting to me. And essentially in the Victorian era, every flower that you could think of had a meaning associated with it. And I was really curious as to where these meanings came from. So we might think about red roses for love, we might think about buttercups for childhood and things like that. But I was so curious as to where all of these meanings came from. So I did tons of research. I think there's over 90 flowers in this book and 10 different bouquets showing you how to combine different flowers. And I discovered that so many of the meanings came from things like mythology, folklore, and even the characteristics of the plants themselves. And so I was so surprised and thrilled that that book ended up doing really, really well. And so my publisher was asking, what else can you do? Which is what they like to do. And so in order to continue it on, we don't really have many other things that exist like the Victorian language of flowers, right? Where everything has a recognized and codified symbol throughout history and throughout time. But we do have stories from history, mythology, folklore, and stories about different birds that we can pull from many different cultures. And surprisingly, many of these stories overlap, and many of these characteristics have inspired for centuries people around the world. And so that's sort of how ornithography got started. And so there's 100 different birds in the book, each of which has a full page illustration. And I had the best time doing the research and the writing and the illustrating. It's just an absolute joy to get to bring all the things that I'm passionate about to life. So I've always been drawing. You can see me and my sister here in this photo in my parents' backyard with the little easel set up. And we both really loved being outside, loved painting, and loved kind of exploring nature through art itself. And I would spend so much of my time outside, collecting little things like acorns and sticks and leaves and, trying to represent them in my paintings. And that eventually led me to going to the Savannah College of Art and Design, where I studied illustration. I graduated in 2013, and I've been working as a freelance illustrator ever since. And so I've had the honor of working with many different publications. In particular, I started out doing a lot of editorial work for places like the New York Times. And eventually it led into books, which is really what I've always wanted to do. So it's kind of a dream come true that I get to write and illustrate books because it's always been one of my great passions. And so I'm going to read you first the introduction to the book. I think it just paints like a good picture of how this kind of got started and where some of these stories are going to be coming from that I'll tell you tonight. So I'll point out the artwork after I give you the little introduction. So birds have inspired us since the dawn of time. Their elegance in flight, captivating songs, and delicate mannerisms spark hope and delight. For centuries, cultures around the world have looked to birds for meaning. often relying on these creatures to teach moral lessons, illuminate history, foretell victory, or warn of doom. The divinatory observation of birds began long ago, at least as far back as ancient Greece, where ornithomancy, the interpretation of omens based on the movements and calls of birds, was integral to the culture. It paved the way for the ancient Roman practice of augury, from which we get the terms auspicious, meaning a good omen, and inauguration, a formal ceremony that in Rome would have involved looking to the birds for signs from the gods. Augurs sought messages in how birds flew and at what height, the number of birds present, their songs, and even their eating patterns. The result of auguries was taken extremely seriously and heavily influenced Roman daily life, politics, and even military strategy. So I pulled a couple images here of some of my favorite representations of augurs in ancient Rome. So we have Tarquin the Elder consulting Attis Nivius the augur, which is a 1690 painting, but you can see how he's pointing to the birds, interpreting their flight and symbols. And then we also have these beautiful ancient Roman coins that feature the lightus, which is a sort of a stick that augurs would use to predict birds' movement and from there be able to make predictions. So, depending on how the birds would fly in that swirly shape would tell them different things. And so this was so important to the culture that it was even represented on money. And you can find many different examples of Roman coins that pull that lightus symbol. And the black and white image is one of my absolute favorites because they are getting these omens from chickens, which was a very common practice. And as a chicken owner myself, I think that this is so fascinating. So occasionally they would understand or know what answer they would need to get from the birds. And so they would either not feed the chickens, and then when they would lay out food for them and all the chickens would eat ravenously, they'd say, "Oh, that's a great sign. Like the chickens are all eating." And sometimes things wouldn't always go that way. And so, they were just getting these messages from the birds, and they would actually influence so many aspects of Roman life and politics, war, and they would, these augurs were important parts of society, even if some of it seems a little funny today. But this is kind of where, we've been looking to the birds for uh, just centuries and centuries. And I think there's something really special about and something so attractive about birds that, they do seem magical. They're flying through the air and they've got beautiful colors and all of those things. So I can definitely see where this is coming from. So back to the introduction. So while augury is no longer a common practice and we don't have a language of birds as standardized as the Victorian language of flowers, we can look to folklore, mythology, and history for insight into the symbolism associated with our feathered friends. By reflecting on dozens of such sources, I have assigned meanings to 100 of my favorite birds, illustrating each one. While I've included many beloved species like the robin, sparrow, and wren, I found I'm most fond of the ugly ducklings, birds with peculiar proportions, curious colors, and fantastic feathers. So here's some of my absolute favorites. I love ostriches and emus and cassowaries and all kinds of birds. The bigger, the better. And I love their eyelashes. I think they're just the coolest. So whether universally beloved or feared, admired or mocked, I've come to believe that every bird has a story to tell. So the next time you see a cardinal at your feeder or a hawk soaring overhead, consider what message it may have for you. What wisdom does it carry, and what secrets might it confide? So here's me with my love of birds. And then that ostrich is from the Natural History Museum in London, where I got to visit last fall and got to see this beautiful ostrich and so many other bird species that have been taxidermied. So one of my absolute favorites that I had to share is the flamingo. And so I think flamingos kind of get a bad reputation, right? Like people think of them as these kind of tacky lawn ornaments and, these kind of silly pink birds. But I think there's a lot more that the pelican or that the flamingo, I should say, has to offer. So in my book, they have a meaning of survival. And these iconic pink birds may explain the origin of the mythological phoenix. Flamingo comes from the Latin flamma, meaning flame, and in ancient times, travelers to the Great Rift Valley in eastern Africa would occasionally see these large, reddish birds through the thick, steamy mists of near boiling volcanic lakes. The creatures were even known to drink the caustic lake water. Reports of these firebirds were passed on to the Greeks and eventually made their way throughout Europe, perhaps inspiring the tale of the phoenix, a bird said to burst into flames and then reemerge from its own ashes. So this is one of my all-time favorite birds since I started doing the research about them. And on the left here, we have an etching from 1806 of a phoenix. And I think you can kind of see how some of these characteristics of the flamingo may have been told and interpreted over time to kind of get to this creature that we think of today. Because, you know, anatomically, probably pretty different, but you know, it's still a bird, and we can kind of trace this all the way back to ancient times, which is so fun and exciting. And flamingos are really absolutely the coolest. You know, they have incredible survival instincts in addition to be able to stand in and drink caustic water. If a lake around them freezes, the flamingo is completely fine. They'll just wait for that water to melt and go about their business and, you know, keep surviving. So these very iconic birds are one of my absolute favorites to share. And then, of course, I have to share the raven, which is one of my all-time favorites. And this, we can trace the raven's meaning of intelligence throughout time, but in particular through Norse mythology. So with jet black feathers and a massive wingspan, the raven's imposing size, keen intelligence, and dark coloring set it apart from all other birds. In Norse mythology, two ravens called Hugin and Munin sit atop the shoulders of the one-eyed god Odin, who we can see in this illustration here. He just got one eye and he's got his two ravens on either shoulder. His companions and his spies, the birds, fly around the world each day and report back to their master, whispering their findings in his ear. The raven's association with Odin, considered the father of the Norse gods, suggests an immense respect for the bird's wisdom, but it also acknowledges its role as a scavenger. Like Odin, the god of war, the raven could be ruthless, circling over battlefields and scavenging for prey. So these incredibly intelligent birds are known for following soldiers into battle because they know that there will be food after. So they kind of get this death association, but it really comes from their amazing and incredible intelligence. They're excellent problem solvers and really fun to watch. They're absolutely massive. If you've never seen one in real life, they're very cool. Much larger than a crow, but I love crows too. So there's love for all the birds. Another one of my favorites to share is the magpie, whose meaning is prophecy. So loud chattering birds with lustrous black and white plumage, magpies belong to the corvid family, like the crow and the raven. They are known for their intelligence, strident call, and association with superstition. The 18th century British nursery rhyme, One for Sorrow, explained what it meant to see a magpie, or two or three. Most modern versions go something like this: 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy. 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So this is a pretty common nursery rhyme in England. You would hear this quite often. I've also included a screenshot from one of the older variants of the magpie song, which goes 1 for sorrow, 2 for luck or mirth, 3 for a wedding, 4 for a death or birth, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told, 8 for heaven, 9 for hell, which is censored here, very Victorian, and 10 for the devil's own cell. Devil also censored, which the Victorians would absolutely do that. Very much about mannerisms and polite society. So I think that's so fun and so interesting that these birds have this prophecy meaning. And then if you ever heard of the band Counting Crows, they got their name from the magpies and from the magpie rhyme. So another one of my favorites is the finch. And this is one of my favorites because it pops up in art history all the time. And if you know me, I am obsessed with art history. I love looking at old paintings from the Northern Renaissance, from the Renaissance, from all the masters. And so the finch has a meaning of domesticity and appreciated for their charming feathers and joyous chirps. Finches have long been kept as pets. Dexterous creatures, they can be taught to perform tricks, such as ringing a bell or lifting a small bucket of food or water on a string. Goldfinches in particular appear frequently in Renaissance depictions of the Madonna and Child. They were a favorite household pet at the time, so they were often given to children. So I pulled some of my favorites And I've been lucky enough to see some of these paintings in real life, which is so fun. So we have here in the center a portrait of Giovanni de' Medici from 1844. So the de' Medici family were very wealthy Florentine family. They were in banking. And so it would make sense that their child would have a goldfinch as a pet. You can really see he's got a hold on that bird, as does the Carlo Crivelli Madonna and Child. He's really holding that goldfinch, squeezing it maybe a little bit too tight. And that's a painting of the Madonna with baby Jesus. And so you often see these goldfinches pop up in these paintings. And the next time you're at an art museum and you're looking at paintings like this, definitely look around and you'll see the goldfinch. More often than not, you'll see the European goldfinch, which are in the paintings here. But I, of course, chose to illustrate the North American one as a North American myself. And I just love our goldfinch. I think it's a really beautiful bird, and I love seeing it on our feeders. So of course I had to include the rooster, which, as I mentioned before, I have chickens. I have 8 hens, who all have very fabulous names, and I love them all very much. And they're actually just a year old now. They were a year old in February, so they're a year and 1 month old, and they're my little chicken babies, and I think they're so fun and so interesting. So the rooster has a meaning of betrayal. And an adult male chicken is larger than the female of the species, with more brightly colored feathers and a larger red comb atop his head. Known to crow in anticipation of the dawn, the rooster and his call have come to signify daybreak. Though his sunrise greeting lends the rooster a mostly cheerful reputation, the bird is also associated with betrayal. All 4 canonical Gospels tell of Jesus' prediction at the Last Supper that his disciple Peter will betray him 3 times before the rooster crows. Indeed, Peter did deny Jesus in the lead up to his crucifixion. In the 9th century, Pope Nicholas I decreed that a rooster be placed atop every church in Europe as a reminder of this betrayal. Because weather vanes were already present on many church steeples, the roosters were added to these devices, creating the now ubiquitous weathercock. The oldest surviving weathercock, the Gallo di Ramperto, was installed around the year 820 atop the bell tower in a church in Brescia, Italy. So I love sharing the image of this 1820 weather vane because it is such a fabulous interpretation of a rooster, and it feels very modern at the same time, despite being something very old. It has like kind of a very graphic style, and it's so cute. I just love that, and it's so fascinating to me how these birds have worked their way into our lives and into culture and into society, and they have been for so long. So we're now getting to the pelican, which is my absolute favorite in the book. I've always loved pelicans because, like I said before, they're kind of one of the ugly duckling birds. They're very interesting looking, and they have one of the strangest and most fascinating folklore of any bird in the book, and any bird that I've come across. And so they have a meaning of duty. And the fascinating lore of these water birds can be traced to the Physiologus, an ancient educational Christian text compiled in the 3rd century by an unknown Greek author. The Physiologus is sort of the basis for medieval bestiaries. So when you see kind of these illustrated manuscripts with these fantastical creatures, many of these stories come from the Physiologus. It states that pelicans kill their young in frustration, then revive them in their remorse using their own blood. The Physiologist goes on to describe this as an allegory for the resurrection of Jesus. This was likely a misunderstanding of how pelicans actually feed their young. They regurgitate food from the red pouch under their bill, pressing it against their chest to empty it completely. The result is a bloody-looking mess. So medieval Christians modified this understanding, believing that in her intense devotion, the pelican mother would wound her own breast to feed her young with her own blood. So you start to see this iconic image of a pelican with a red chest with her babies around it. So pelicans from the Northumberland bestiary from about 1250 to 1260, we can see this very stylized interpretation of a pelican. Maybe the illustrator had not seen this bird before and they were going off of descriptions, but you can see her wounding her own chest and feeding her babies her blood after murdering them. So very fun. One of my absolute favorites because it's just so interesting. And I had never seen this symbol before I started doing research on the book, but the funny thing is, whenever you start learning about something, you tend to see it everywhere. So I started noticing this when I would go into art galleries and I'd see different pieces. And I was at the Uffizi Museum in Florence a few years ago, and I saw this altarpiece, this cross, and I saw the bird at the top, and I thought to myself, that has to be the pelican. It has the image, the white bird, the red chest, and the babies. And so I went on the Uffizi website after and did a search for just the word pelican, and it popped right up. So this is, in fact, a depiction of a pelican, which is interesting. You know, we kind of get that stylization in these older works because, you know, perhaps we haven't seen that before.
I have to just jump in there and say
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
How
Like to
funny
see
is
that
that?
depicted in the
Yeah.
top of the crucifix and the bestiary too, but just I've never seen that before. What an interesting little bit of information there.
That's why this one is my favorite because
Yeah,
it's
that's
just,
neat.
it's so fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it's gruesome and dark, but also fun.
It's unusual too. That's
Yeah.
really
Definitely. And you start to see this symbol more and more.
yeah.
So we have this portrait of Elizabeth I, painted by Nicholas Hilliard from 1575. And so Queen Elizabeth considered herself the Pelican Mother and that she would sacrifice anything for her people. And so she would this is a pendant that she had made of the pelican, and she would wear it often and wore it in this portrait in particular. And it's called the Pelican Portrait because of this. And one of my favorite things that didn't actually make it into the book on the Pelican page is this amazing poster from World War II from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association. So this was to encourage people to donate blood during the war. And it says, your blood can save a life. And you can see these little pelican babies in a helmet, and the pelican mother feeding them her blood above it. It's just one of the best stories. It has such fascinating visuals, and it all comes all the way back from the 3rd century. It's so fascinating that this symbol has persisted for so long and remained a part of our cultures. And of course, I can't mention birds without mentioning the duck and the swan. So often in this book, I found birds with meanings or stories that overlapped. And one of them is the duck and the swan. So I'm sure we all know the story of the ugly duckling, but I will shortly read out a little description of it. So ducks have a meaning of transfiguration, and they appear in many children's stories, but perhaps the most iconically in Hans Christian Andersen's The Ugly Duckling, a tale in which an unusually looking duckling is relentlessly teased by his siblings. After much hardship, the duckling finds himself welcomed into a flock of wild swans. Seeing his reflection in the water, he realizes that he is not a duck at all, but in fact a swan. Folklore featuring ducks confused for swans and vice versa abounds, perhaps because the two species belong to the same family of water birds. Interestingly, in another one of Andersen's stories, The Wild Swans, he modifies a traditional Norwegian tale. In the original, 12 boys are transformed into ducks, but in Andersen's version, there are 11 boys and they are transformed into swans. In both stories, the boy's sister works to restore their human form. It's a great story. If you've never read The Wild Swans, the sister is working at a wheel, and she's weaving and she's making them her brother's sweaters. And before time runs out, she's able to make sweaters for all but one of the brothers, which it's missing. The sweater's missing one of its sleeves, and so he has a wing left in its place, which is so cool. I just love that. So if we go over to the swan page, they have a meaning of metamorphosis, very similar to the transfiguration of the duck. Elegant, alluring water birds, swans have appeared in a number of myths, many of which describe the swans that transform into humans or humans that become swans. In one such tale from Ireland called The Children of Lear, a jealous stepmother turned her four stepchildren into swans. They lived for 900 years and were revered for their enchanting songs and poems. So the author of The Wheel of the Year, Fiona Cook, she's a fantastic and wonderful author and a joy to work with. And she mentioned to me that her name, Fionnuala, comes from the Children of Lear story, which is so fun. I just love that. I have to share that because she's so wonderful and great to work with, and we both have this amazing swan connection. Perhaps the most famous of all swan tales is Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. The ballet features Odette, a princess transformed into the titular bird by an evil sorcerer, Baron von Rothbart. Odette can only take human form between midnight and daybreak, which is when Prince Siegfried falls in love with her. The sorcerer tricks Siegfried into professing his love, not for Odette, but for Rothbart's own daughter, Odile. When Siegfried realizes his mistake, he finds Odette, who is cursed to remain a swan forever. The two throw themselves into the lake, and their love breaks the curse. So that's another one of my favorite tales. We can't mention swans without Swan Lake. And I actually ended up naming one of my chickens Odette after Swan Lake, but I thought it would be a little bit too mean to name another one Odile. So there's just the singular Odette, and she's cursed to remain a chicken. But she's very sweet and a very silly chicken to have around. And one of the last stories I'm going to share with you all is the crane. And I put this in because my friend Jen is a very talented weaver, and I found this story fascinating, and I shared it with her when I was writing the book. And so cranes have a meaning of fortune, and the crane's graceful beauty has given rise to dozens of myths. In Japan, where it is rumored that cranes live for 1,000 years, the birds are revered as symbols of fortune and longevity. In the story of Tsusuro no Ogashi, meaning the crane's return of a favor, a poor man nurses an injured crane back to life. After the bird is healed and flies away, the man finds a beautiful woman who becomes his wife. She tells her husband not to come into her room until she has finished creating something that will make them wealthy. After a week, she presents him with a beautiful weaving, but she appears to be ill. He sells the weaving, and she begins to make another. This time, he looks in on her, breaking his promise not to enter her room, and sees that she is in fact the same crane that he rescued. She has been disguising herself as a woman and this whole time, and using her own feathers to weave beautiful silks for him to sell. When she discovers him looking in on her, she tells him that she can no longer stay with him now that he has discovered her secret. So kind of a tragic story here with the crane, but they are symbols of wealth and fortune in many different cultures. And what I love about this story is that when we think about weaving today, we might not think about the physical toll that it would take, but weaving back in the Edo period in Japan, when this story came about, it was a very laborious process, and it was very difficult to do. It involved using your entire body on what's called a backstrap loom. And if you look up a YouTube video of people working on a backstrap loom, it is a super physical process. You have to be very strong to do this. And so the fact that this bird lady is putting all of her feathers and making these beautiful weavings for her husband to sell is it's touching, and it's sad and tragic, and also a really beautiful story. So I always like to share that just because I have a friend who's a weaver, and I think it's such a cool tie-in. So a little bit about the illustrations in the book. So there's 100 different illustrations, and the way that I like to work is I start out with a black and white sketch. And so it's essentially just line work, and it shows my publisher and my editor where the artwork is going to sit on the page. So it gives them a sense of composition, and it sort of lays out this essentially book plan where they can see how this is going to shape up to be. And my sketches don't tend to use a lot of color. And when you're doing something like 100 different illustrations for a book, your time becomes very precious. So some of these sketches are pretty simplified. So we just have sort of the pose of the bird, and then I try to get some kind of organic forms and flow in my work, which really starts out in the sketch. From there, I will make a detailed pencil drawing. So I use a graphite pencil, and I sort of work in lots of different textures for the wings and the feet and any sort of objects that might appear in the illustration. So it starts out in a sort of half traditional and half digital process. So I've been working this way since I started illustrating. I kind of started doing this in college, and I really found this was a really fun way of working because it allowed me to keep a lot of the texture that I'm really fond of in my work, but still allow me to make changes and things if my client needs it. So thankfully, I don't typically have to make a lot of changes for clients, especially for my book client, my publisher, Andrews McMeel. are all very excited about what I'm doing. So I think I only had to make one revision at the sketch stage, which was really amazing. So when we get into the pencil, I have just stacks and stacks of these drawings. I need to get a better filing system for my office, but I've got tons of these. And I just really like looking at them because it's completely different from what it ends up looking at, but it's such like an integral part of the process. So from there, I scan the artwork in, scan in that pencil drawing, and I typically work in Photoshop, and I digitally paint underneath the pencil drawing. So you can still sort of see this texture and detail that I've gotten through the pencil, but then there's digital color added. And so lots of shading. I essentially block things off in different shapes, and then I can change things like the background color very easily. And so there's no time spent kind of filling in lines around it, which is great because it allows my process to be a lot speedier, which when you're working on a book with such like a high volume number of illustrations, it becomes very labor intensive. So I definitely try my hardest to make the process as smooth as possible, but I still really want to keep that handmade feel to the work. So this process is it's fun. Really, I love getting to add the color. And you can kind of change things as you go. And if my client gets back to me and says that they don't like a certain color, they don't think it's going to print well, it's very easy to make changes from there. So on the left here, we have the final illustration for the Quetzal, and on the right is the lapwing, I believe.
Jessica, may I ask you a question about your
Yeah,
technique? So all the color when you put it in, is it all done digitally? So like the
yeah,
highlights and the shading and the scissors and the textile, yeah.
yeah. So all that shading is done digitally.
Okay.
So all we really have from the pencil drawing is
Okay.
these lines.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so you can kind of see how they change a bit because,
Yeah.
I try to establish sort of a pattern of light to dark with the pencil drawing, but things get changed and more intense. And I think the shading really brings it to life in the coloring stage.
Cool.
It kind of makes things a little bit more three-dimensional. Yeah, but it took a long time for me to develop my style to come to
Yeah.
this kind of point as well, because it's tough. Having a distinctive style is something that makes you very marketable as an illustrator, but it's like always something that a lot of art school kids struggle with. And so finding this technique, I think, really helped me establish my style and establish, how I kind of see things. So I can stop sharing my screen now and we can look at some questions if that sounds good.
Yeah, actually, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
I was curious about the folklore side of it.
Hmm.
Because I haven't read your series about mermaids and dragons and other
Yeah.
creatures, but it seems like an interest of yours. But I was just wondering, is there a particular, like, how did you get into that interest? And is there a particular culture or mythology that's interesting for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just learning about like Greek mythology and world history in school, like I think in my 10th grade high school class, we covered like world mythology and world history. And that was just the most fascinating thing to me. I always really loved it and found it really interesting when different cultures from different parts of the world would have stories that overlapped. So I always found that super, super fascinating. And we did a project on Greek mythology, I remember in 10th grade. And we read, I think it's Edith Hamilton's book Mythology. And I don't know, I read the whole thing cover to cover. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I've always really loved Greek mythology in particular, because I just think some of the stories about the gods, controlling fate and destiny and things like the Odyssey, I think it's so fascinating. Yeah, I love the different Greek gods and goddesses and battles that would happen and that, you know, terrible things would happen because of the gods. And I just found that to be, a great explanation for things going on when things don't quite go your way. And so I always thought that that was a really great story. So doing the research is always my favorite part of starting any new project. So whenever I get to order a bunch of new books or check a bunch of books out from the library about a different topic, I think that's the most fun part. And I just love reading. So any kind of, modern interpretation of different mythologies and things I love too, like Madeline Miller's books, like Circe is one of my favorite books. Yeah, so there's just so many amazing stories, and I love Athena. I thought she was always the coolest, and Artemis as well. So there's a lot of really cool, strong, like female characters in Greek mythology as well. So I always thought that that was really rad, really interesting.
Great. That's very cool. I was curious too. I always like to um, ask artists about their kind of career path or their
Mhm.
how they make that work. And when you and Erich and I were talking before,
Mhm.
you mentioned that you have an agent.
We do.
So I was just wondering how that, I don't know, I was curious how that part of it works and how you kind of came into that situation.
Yeah, so at the beginning of my career as an illustrator, I spent a lot of time doing editorial work, so illustrations for magazines and newspapers and that kind of thing. And what's great about editorial work and what's terrible about editorial work is that it's very fast paced. So that can be a great thing, right? Because you're moving through a lot of work at once, and but you know it's tough to do because a 2-day deadline for a newspaper is generous at times. And so it makes it very tough on the artist to produce something of the quality and caliber of a piece that maybe would generally take a week, that you only have to do in a few hours, which is, you know, a lot of illustrators start out doing editorial work because it tends to be one of the more faster paced categories. It's a great way to get your foot in the door and meet different art directors. But a few years into that, you know, I noticed I don't typically get hired for these types of like business articles and things like that. Like my style is more in the realm of realism. And so, you know, artists that have more graphic kind of styles, and they are better suited for some of those jobs. And my interests are in like plants and animals and history and mythology. And so I would typically only get hired for these editorial type jobs, when they had a story that aligned really well with those interests, which is a blessing and also a curse, right? So I would also practice in my free time and make a lot of illustrations myself. So I started working in kind of the stationery space, and I would design greeting cards and prints, enamel pins and notepads and things like that that I would sell through my own shop, which is actually how my literary agent found me. So she saw an enamel pin that I had designed on Tumblr. Actually, her husband saw it and showed it to her, and she sent me an email and asked, "Do you have any book ideas?" And I think this was back in 2018-ish. And
Yes.
yeah, go ahead.
No, no, I just that's
Oh,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah. It's
Just
it's
came to
funny
you.
how like these
Yeah,
things work because it
yeah.
is a small community of people, really. And so I had one book idea, which was for florography.
Mm.
And so she helped me put together a book proposal for that, which she sent and pitched to a lot of different publishers. And the great thing about publishing is that there's lots of different publishing houses, and you just need one to say yes. So thankfully, Andrews McMeel, they were very excited about it, and they bought the book, and so I got to finish it. So my book proposal only had, I think, like 3 to 5 illustrations and some sample of my writing. And from there, they were very excited about it. And Florography came out in 2020, which is such an odd time for a book to come out because it's, you know, everyone was at home. But I think it kind of worked in Florography's favor, especially with people getting interested in gardening and things like that. And I also got very into gardening during the pandemic, so I'm a big gardener now. But eventually from there, the Folklore Field Guide series also started coming out in 2020 with the Natural History of Fairies and all of those sorts of books. And so kind of all the book projects started coming in at once, which was really wonderful. And I've not had to look back since. So that's so much fun. And I just love books. I'm a big reader. So anytime I get to work on a book or work with an author or publisher is really a lot of fun.
It sounds like you get some inspiration or you do research at museums. Is there any that you're looking forward to return to, or is there any on your list to visit?
Yeah, so I've always wanted to go to the Field Museum in Chicago. I'd really love to go see. They have like a big whale fall skeleton, which I would really want to see that in person. Which is Chicago is actually where Fiona Cook is based, who wrote The Wheel of the Year. So I would love to go visit Fiona and go hang out at the Field Museum. But yeah, I love any kinds of museums. I lived in Gainesville, Florida for a bit, and there was a really amazing natural history museum there that had this like gorgeous giant sloth
Hmm.
skeleton, which is it's intimidatingly big, like to see how these ancient creatures would be walking the earth. But yeah, it's really fun. I'll go to really any museum, any botanic garden, things like that. I'm always ready to sign up for and go see because there's always something new to learn and something new to see.
It seems like you've been pretty, hard at work and prolific. Do you work with a regimented schedule or in fits and starts?
Yeah, definitely. I think the best thing about my job is that every day looks different, but it's all following a schedule. Because I'm a very to-do list, schedule-minded person. I have to like map out my time, otherwise nothing will get done. But somehow if it's written down in like a logical schedule, it actually does get done, which is, amazing how the brain works. So yeah, I love that every day can be different. So I might be working on writing and I might be working on researching, sketching, or working on final artwork or some combination of all of those during my day. And yeah, so the way that books get made too, I think is really fascinating. Especially in the nonfiction genre, because in a book proposal, like the ones that I present to my publisher, the whole book isn't written. It's just a few pages and a few illustrations. So from there, once a book is purchased by a publisher, I have to do the rest of the research and the rest of the writing and the rest of the sketches and the illustrations and the artwork and all of that. So generally we have like a timeline, which is usually around a year per project. So it's interesting how it gets divided up, but you know, it's fun though. It's a challenge, but it's fun at the same time. And I like knowing like, oh, I have to finish 3 bird illustrations a week and I'll be good. Or I need to do 3 a day if it's closer to the deadline and I haven't been working as hard or I took a nice long break. But yeah, it's definitely very much mapped out and I tend to write big lists and checklists of like for ornithography, I had a list of all 100 birds and I would have a check if I did the writing and then a check if I did the sketch and then fill it in once I did the color and sent that in. So it's a fun process because you kind of really get to dive in and really experiment and but the schedule essentially keeps me on track and on target. So there is some room for exploration and play and that kind of thing. But it is a lot of drawing and a lot of being alone and listening to audiobooks while I draw. So
That must be very exciting when you get the green light on a project and you go from think about going from 5 to 100
yeah,
illustrations.
it is. It's so much fun and it's like when you're in that period of waiting to hear back about a project or waiting to hear,
Yeah,
you have the green light to get started. That's when you're just like, I'm treading water. I need something to keep going. So yeah, that's really the best part.
great. I appreciate the museum question, E. Rich. I wanted to just let you know, Jessica, you might be interested in this if you haven't been. There is a museum in Massachusetts called the Museum of American Bird Art that's part of Mass Audubon.
Yeah.
And do you know about it already?
Yeah, I've heard of it because
It's
it's definitely
fantastic.
on my list.
Yeah, so we did a show last summer. We borrowed a bunch of their pieces
Oh,
to show
good.
here. They're in between buildings. They're building
Mhm.
a new museum, but if you go to their website, actually, their whole collection is up.
That's
Uh,
so amazing. It's so
yeah,
great that
and
they're
it's a
able to detail
fantastic
that.
collection if you like
Yeah.
birds. So yeah,
I will definitely have to check that out. I think I'm supposed to be in Massachusetts in May for some Jane Austen's Garden book events.
but
So I'll have to go and check it out.
it's worth being in touch with them. Their
Yeah,
museum building is closed at the moment, and they are working on a new building. But if you get in touch with them, I'm
yeah,
sure they would give you access to, and you can see everything that's in the collection
that would be so cool.
online.
I
So
would
yeah,
love that.
it's neat. Yeah.
Yeah, museums and libraries are like absolutely the best resources, especially if you're an artist or a writer too. And I think today, like, especially living in the age of like AI, where you don't know what's real and what's not, we have to rely on like our written resources and things like museums and libraries to bring that information so that we have access to that and continue to. I think it's more important now than ever before.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mhm.
I don't see any further questions here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any.
If anyone would like to jump in there, feel free with use the Q&A button. I wanted to just also mention, maybe I should ask you to jump in on this one, Erich, too. I know that this is being recorded and this talk can be made available, but could you say a little bit more about how that works, Erich?
Yeah, I think yeah, so both at the Wendell Gilley and then Southwest Harbor, we have YouTube channels where we post the talks. So those will be available, and usually we try to get them up within 24, 48 hours.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, anyone that missed it will be able to check it out then.
Excellent. And we have a comment here from a couple comments. Right,
Ooh,
a question and a comment. Do you see those, Jessica? Or
I
I can read them.
do, yes.
Okay.
Let's see. Fantastic presentation. Your work is so beautiful. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Amanda. There's a question from Theo that says, did you find roots for the association between cardinals and visits from the dead? I know some people make this association. I've heard this a lot as well. So in my book, I talk more about cardinals and their association with cardinals in the church, and where we get the word cardinal meaning important, and the red color of the cardinal coming from that. But I could not find much in terms of written down and recorded folklore about cardinals and visits from the dead, but it is like a folklore that I hear quite often, and especially living in the South, you hear that one a lot. And it's interesting because it's like it's so tough sometimes when you hear these things, but you can't find a, you know, scholarly source to kind of back those things up. But I'm sure there's tons of information and stories to be told about lots of birds. And, the thing about ornithography and the style of these sorts of books is that the entries tend to be pretty short. So you're kind of focusing on sort of one thing and not too many. Um, but yeah, definitely. It's something to look into, and hopefully we have more like digitized resources for things like stories and folklore like that people have been telling for a long time so that these stories can get out there and be told. And then there's another question that says, what kind of books do you listen to while drawing? I love this question because honestly, I'll listen to just about anything, but I tend to focus on fiction. And so I really like speculative fiction. I tend to like books that are like fairly short. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is Sea of Tranquility, by Emily St. John Mandel. I also really like The Starless Sea and The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Yeah, there's so many that I could name. I try to read around 75 to 100 books a year, typically just through audiobooks, while I'm working. So I always have like a really long list, of books. And right now I'm reading The Buried Giant, which has been pretty interesting. It's very folklore and kind of scary monsters, medievally times. So it's kind of fun. Yeah, if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Oh, here's one that says, I'd be sure to mention your website because I love your print stickers and cards. Oh, that's really sweet. Thank you, Paula. Yeah, my website is jessica-roux.com. I think I also own jessicaroux.com and it just redirects there. And then if you're interested in things like prints and stickers, stationery, and that kind of thing, I still do that, and that's at shopjessicaroux.com. And I package and print all the things myself here in my house. So it's really a fun thing to do. And I wholesale to a lot of you know, shops around the world, which is honestly really fun and exciting. And yeah, it's a great, you know, way to keep having a steady income as an illustrator by offering things like prints and stickers and that kind of thing.
I mentioned in the beginning that I am a fan of your website, so I'm glad that came up again. And I didn't mention your merchandise on there, but it's fantastic. And you were mentioning the stickers. It's
Yes.
just people have seen your artwork tonight, but imagining being able to see it in that format, they're fantastic. And it's kind of cool. I actually noticed on your website one of your pins.
Yeah.
You were mentioning that's how your agent came to you, but really cool.
Yeah, they're so fun to make. I really like that aspect of illustration as well. And I've gotten to do some illustrations for brands like Fable England and that kind of thing, like accessories kind of thing, necklaces and scarves and illustrations for those types of products, which is really fun. I think, yeah, the great thing about illustration is you never know what's going to come in. And so it can be really exciting projects like that. It can be books, editorial and that kind of thing. And being able to write as well is a great skill to have as an illustrator because it's, you know, you can really show your work to a much wider audience.
Great. Well, one thing I noticed or I appreciated just thinking about, we're coming up to 7 o'clock and just saying thank you to everyone. But I noticed in your book in the acknowledgments, the beginning of the last paragraph there is most of all, thank you to the birds. So I appreciated that line.
I know, I just, they're so inspiring. And before starting on this project, I don't think I would have considered myself to be a birder. But now I've gotten more and more into it. I've gotten better at identifying birds, and I'd always tell everyone to download the Merlin app so that it identifies bird calls around you, which can help you identify different birds. And it's always helpful to have around when I have my chickens out so I can see if there's a hawk nearby. But thankfully we've got a big family of crows that just moved in, and so they tend to keep the hawks away, and they like watching the chickens, which is kind of fascinating because they're such smart birds. I think they wonder what the chickens are doing down there. But yeah, I love birds, and being able to work on a project like this where I get to combine things like animals and history and mythology and folklore is really the best of all the worlds that I find so fascinating.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. It's always a joy to get to share ornithography and some of the weirder bird stories out there.
That's great.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Erich. This has been great. Thank you, Jessica.
thank you.
Night, everybody.